Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Breaking Brews Podcast, a podcast focused on the business side of beer and what's driving today's thriving craft beer industry. Whether you're one of the thousands of people making craft beer what it is today, or just love great beer and want to know more about it, this show is here to cover everything from sales, marketing, branding, culture, and much, much more. The Breaking Brews Podcast delivers real-life scenarios and experiences from industry professionals that will help your beer knowledge evolve. To tap into more great beer content, visit breakingbrews.com today. And now, the moment you've been waiting for. Let's get this session started. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is time once again to gather around the microphone for another installment of the Breaking Brews Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Cercone, and we are back with Session 6 of the show. If you haven't done so already, hop over to iTunes and give the show a rating and review. You can subscribe to the show there, on Stitcher, on Google Play Music, on Spotify, pretty much everywhere you listen to podcasts. Also, you can stay current on what's happening with the show over at breakingbrews.com/podcast. So today, we are talking with Dennis Hock, the founder of Strange Roots Experimental Ales, as well as Bert Mooney, the director of operations at Strange Roots Experimental Ales, about rebranding. These guys went through a rebrand throughout 2017 and into 2018. They were formerly known as Draai Laag Brewing. And we got to hear the story of how they got from point A to point B with rebranding their company. So if this is something that you're considering in the brewery world, this is an episode you definitely want to listen to because you're going to get some good perspective from two guys that went through the process. And we're going to discuss a lot of cool things about the brand. And for those that don't know, Strange Roots Experimental Ales, it's a name that fits those guys perfectly. They are a traditional farmhouse brewery. They do a lot of wild beers. They're really doing some cool stuff, and you get to hear about what they're up to. You get to learn a little bit more about the inspiration behind what built what was formerly known as Draai Laag and what continues to be Strange Roots to this day. Again, if you're thinking about rebranding, if you're considering going through that whole process, you get to hear firsthand what it's all about. All of the things you're going to have to go through and all of the things you're going to have to consider are covered here on the show. Now, before we jump into the show, I want to tell you how you can connect with Strange Roots on the World Wide Web. You can find them on their website at strangerootsbeer.com. They're also on Instagram at strangerootsbeer and on Twitter at strangerootspgh. And you can find them on Facebook. Just look for Strange Roots Experimental Ales. Also, before we jump into the show, I did want to point out we did record this episode in the Brewer's Lounge at the Strange Roots Brewery, so there were a few background noises that you're going to hear throughout the show. I did mess with the sound slightly, but nothing to the point where you're not going to be able to consume the information that was dropped and get a good understanding of the subject matter at hand. So I do apologize in advance for any sort of sound issues with this particular episode. Hope you'll forgive me. Hope you'll keep tuning in. But we make up for it with great conversation, some great content, and great times had by all. Glad you're along with us for this ride. This is Session 6 of the Breaking Brews Podcast. Let's dive in, boys and girls. Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to the Brewer's Lounge. I feel very privileged. This is nice. So,
thank you.
We are here at Strange Roots Experimental Ales in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, and I am joined by Dennis and Bert of the brewery. And my words can't do justice for what you guys do, so I'm going to let you introduce yourselves, tell the audience a little bit about yourselves in the beer world, outside the beer world. Basically, what do you want people to know about you? Either one of you can take the lead.
Yeah, I'll start. So my name is Bert. I've been with the company for a little over 2.5 years. Started out working in the tap rooms. Was kind of drawn to this style of beer. Really appreciated it. Was working in more like fine, higher-end dining and was doing a lot of sourcing for a restaurant here in the city. And that's kind of how I stumbled upon Strange Roots or ex-Draai Laag at that point in time. Just really appreciated the background, the biology behind it, and the care that went into it. And so I think I actually hosted a dinner at Cure one night, and Dennis came in with his wife, Jacqueline, and they got there early to help out, and just kind of started chit-chatting and stuff, and kind of formed a relationship there. And like I said, I was very much so at that point in time looking to get into the brewing industry. And so started out with just getting my foot in the door, bartending, and kind of ended up here working, loving it. So,
yeah, okay. So I'm Dennis Hock. I'm the founder of the company. I don't know. I've always loved wild and sour beer, and this is what we do. And I just think there's something magic about taking a local environment and working with it, not only creatively but scientifically, and trying to make something unique, something different to provide the market.
So this might be redundant based on what you just said, Dennis, but when you guys got started out, obviously, and Bert made mention of this, you were known as Draai Laag. You're now known as Strange Roots. That's really going to be the meat and potatoes of today's episode, is talking about how you guys went through that rebrand. But let's learn a little bit more about your brewery. So what was it that made you want to zero in on the sour style or the wild ales?
I come from science. That's the truth, right? So that's science.
We all do, right?
Yeah.
Technically.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah. So I come from a science background, and when I started brewing when I was 17 years old, and that was all done in a way to more or less experiment, trying to find new organisms, trying to search them out within your local environment to see what they would do. And it was always magical to me to see how different organisms interplay with each other in any given situation in a micro environment or whatever you want to call it. And every year you get new organisms, and every year you find new organisms. And I don't know, there's something special about that, in my opinion. Like, you might find something that nobody ever discovered before, or you might create a process that nobody's really ever thought of before. And by doing that, it's really the mesh between science and art. It's a creative way to express yourself, and to do it through using science there's very limited opportunities to do that. That's what I find so beautiful about making wild and sour beer.
So have you felt any pressure from the outside world? Has there been a lot of requests for you guys to do an IPA or a stout or something that's not really in the wheelhouse that you've created?
Of course. And that was not a pivotal part, but that was one of the parts or the reasons in which that rebranding took place. It's been a learning process, I'll say that, because it's kind of difficult to teach an old dog new tricks. But we're chugging away at it, and we're always optimistic, and we're not trying to reseat who we are. We're just trying to add a little diversity.
With that in mind, what are some of the trends developing in today's beer world that just, whether they make you shake your head or you just go, damn, I can't believe that's getting over? Anything out there that's really hit home in that capacity?
I guess if I was to really say it, I'd just say, like, there's a time and a place for every single beer. That's the honest to God's truth. When I'm fishing, I don't want to drink sour beer. When you're sitting around with a bunch of buddies in your garage someday, you don't want to drink sour beer, right? So there's, again, a time and a place for every beer. The notion of people aging cans just drives me insane. I understand there's a can market. I myself buy canned beer when there's a need for it, or when it's beneficial or advantageous for whatever you're doing. However, there's been an astronomical amount of times where people put beer in cans, and it either gets traded or it sits on a shelf, and it's like a miniature grenade at that point. Yeah. So it's canned beer, in my opinion, is made primarily to drink fresh right then and there. And, I was buying some beer from a distributor the other day, and I heard somebody in line in front of me telling me about how they're going to age these cans, and there's no difference between aging in a bottle and a can, and I don't agree with that at all. So that trend, if it's building up in a thought process from a market standpoint that people feel that they can age beer in cans, I don't agree with that at all. That's frustrating to me.
And I've talked to some brewers, too, that have said that they're canning this beer for you to drink now. Like,
yes.
enjoy it now.
Yes.
I don't. I'm with you. That one's one that it still boggles my mind.
Yeah.
I got into a conversation with a guy on Instagram last year about Hop Slam,
Okay.
which
I love bells.
yeah, and why would you ever age an IPA, right?
Yeah.
And he's telling me how good it was. I'm like, dude, no way. Like
I
your
don't
hop
agree.
character is
I don't
completely dead.
Yep.
Well, but the honey stands out. I'm like, but that's not really all you're drinking it for.
It's
Like it's the
counterintuitive to what it
combination of
is.
everything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I decided, you know what? I've got a can left. I'm just going to see, and I did it. And it sucked.
Yep. I agree.
I just don't understand the appeal. Like that beer is so good when it's fresh,
I agree.
and yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Don't age your IPAs,
No,
guys.
no, that's not their intended purpose. And
No.
you know that whole initiative of drink it fresh was probably one of the smartest things I ever heard of.
Sure.
Especially for those beers, because you lose all the hop character, you lose nuances that were there that are no longer there, and that's what it's intended to be, drunk quickly.
And that's really when you think of hyper local and people coming to breweries, you're getting beer fresh from the source. Well, when you're getting it fresh from the source, why do you want to sit on it for 2
Yeah.
years?
Yeah.
Come back in 2 years and drink more fresh beer from the source. I'm on a soapbox now. I'm going to have to get down.
No,
so
you're
we can
absolutely
continue.
right. And, you know, from another perspective as well, like what we do here, all of our beers are bottle conditioned.
Right.
They're made to age. They're better when they age, and we already age them an extended period of time, depending upon what beer it is and where it's in development. But for the most part, this is a style of beer that you can lay down just like a vintage of wine.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't coalesce them together as one just because one is a beer and the other one's a beer. You're supposed to, in your mind, say, this style of beer is meant to be drunk now. This style of beer, I can lay it down just like a wine. And that's, again, the diversity that I'm speaking of. There's a time and a place for every single beer.
Right. So I guess that's a good question to ask you guys. So your core brands, the majority of your beers have been aged for X amount of months, sometimes even years. If I come in and buy that beer, let's say you aged it for a year, you've done the work for me.
Yeah.
Is there really any point to me aging it for another year, another 2 years, or should I enjoy it on the spot?
See-
And that might be a question that could be answered either way.
You're right. And, you know, that's the best part about putting it in the customer's hands. So you've invested into this bottle. You've invested into this one product. You could try it now and see where we're happy with it. Or you can say, you know what, I want to lay this down and age it. And that's your choice. So you're adding to the process as a consumer. That's where I think it's pivotal, is that you are just as much as part of this process as we are if you want to age that beer and put the time into aging that beer. And I always suggest, like, all of our beers age well, but just like wine, there's a peak time. There's a peak time where some of those things may drop off. Some of those things may mesh together a little bit better, maybe worse. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's what kind of brings our customer base with us on this journey.
That's great.
And that's something that right now, like, we're starting to kind of reformat our program as far as releases are concerned, with being able to offer future linear pairings. So, for example, some core beers that come out, you know, we decide that they're appropriate during that point in time, and then we'll hold back a small allotment for that next year's release to go along with it, so you can try them in a linear fashion, so, and see how they've aged and progressed. So, kind of a cool thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we may have to. I think we could devote a whole episode to just that. Honestly,
Yeah,
I mean, because
I
there's
agree.
a lot of ins and outs to that. And
I
I
agree.
think there's a lot that people can learn, but we will come back to that another day. Today, what I wanted to sit down with you guys and talk about, delving into rebranding. You guys have very recently, and I guess depending on when you folks out there that are hearing this actually pick it up, these guys just went through a rebrand in 2017-18. The brewery was formerly known as Draai Laag, and then has now been rebranded as Strange Roots Experimental Ales. So let's start with the beginning. What was the inspiration behind the name Draai Laag?
Draai Laag was something that I created. And the fundamentals of Draai Laag was basically to create this traditional farmhouse brewery that didn't buy yeast, that used its terroir, that used extended barrel aging to do all of what it did or created. And quite frankly, to be a little more on that experimental side. And we did a lot of weird stuff, and we do a lot of weird stuff. We're weird people. And, you know, the basis of Draai Laag was to like introduce people to what beer can be and how far you could take it to extreme levels, and still maintain that farmhouse methodology, but project it in different manners in which we add a little creative elements from things that inspire us throughout every day, every week, every month, whatever. Just general wonderment, bringing in that science of that wonderment of I wonder if, and then implement that somehow into something that you can put into a bottle that someone may or may not, hopefully they do, appreciate it.
So a lot of that philosophy hasn't changed with the new name. So
That's correct.
how long did you operate under the Draai Laag name?
From 2011 is when I opened up in Millvale until last year. I believe it was roughly March is when we converted over to Strange Roots Experimental Ales. So, yeah.
And I should say, too, so you started at the location in Millvale, and now we're in your new production brewery here in Gibsonia.
Yes.
Did the name change or the rebrand, did that coincide with moving into the bigger facility?
It did, only on a timeline level.
So more coincidental than anything?
That's probably more coincidental than anything, but it was a good time to do it if we were ever going to do it. You get a new facility, you got a lot of new things coming along, and there was a lot more to it than that. It's multifaceted, but it fit in perfectly with the timeline, so it was the right time to do it.
So for those local to the Pittsburgh area, or for those that are going to be visiting the Pittsburgh area, you can check out the Millvale Tap Room. That's still going Tuesday through Saturday.
Yes.
And then you can check out the production facility that also has a tasting room here.
Fridays and Saturdays.
Fridays and Saturdays. So I got a nice tour of the outside, and there's some big things coming. I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
To be continued on that. Well, let's continue to talk about the rebranding process. So when did you make the decision to go a different direction and change names, and why was that decision made?
It was a very difficult decision. We struggled with it for a long time, but it didn't really come into a full fruition, so to speak, or understanding exactly what it's going to take to do it until probably of December of 2017. And at that point, it was, again, it's multifaceted. So we're looking at, why to rebrand? Should we rebrand? Is it going to gain anything? What's the benefit of doing it, if at all? So looking at every perspective and kind of cultivating over all the decisions that we wanted to do and look at, it just seemed to be the best thing for us at the time. It has been fruitful. It was not necessarily beneficial, but we didn't take a lot of, negative perspective towards it. There were some people that were definitely against it 100%, but I don't think they really grasped the reasons why.
That actually leads to my next question, and we can keep jumping back and forth here, but the pushback, was it more in-house, or was it your partners outside with distributors, wholesalers, things like that, or even customers? Who really had the
primarily
blowback?
Customers, and that was our biggest concern, was customers. Mm-hmm. Customers internally, myself, it was an internal struggle, right? Because I was Draai Laag, I'm still Strange Roots, but it was everything that I built at that point. I wasn't concerned about a name. As long as the product's the same, that's what I care about. And as long as we continue to do what we do and kind of push the measures or push the limits, so to speak, on what we see as important at the time, that's in my opinion, the most important thing. The real driving force behind a lot of this was more or less, when you look at Draai Laag and you look at the way that we did things at Draai Laag, it's similar to Strange Roots, but it's not the same. So part of that change is that, we wanted to go outside of sour beer. We wanted to start trying to see, everybody has interest and everybody has things that they're interested in. And when I talk to the guys that work here and I talk to everybody involved, everybody said, I love our sour beer. I love what we do, but it'd be really nice just to make a nice stout. It'd be really nice to make a this. It'd be really nice to make a that, whatever it may be. We're not all just sour beer. That's all we drink is sour beer. That's not what we do. We appreciate all different types of styles of beer. So it got to a point where it was like, if we like making these other styles of beer, maybe we should open up a second brand, a clean brand. And not necessarily all clean, but, for that. And then looking back on it, we realized we don't have the resources to support two brands. That's 2 social media pages. That's 2 social media accounts. That's, you're looking at everything involved. That's labeling. That's TTB. You got to file. I mean, it's a lot of work.
Absolutely.
So, when it came down to it, we started saying, well, maybe we should just rebrand the whole thing. And that was shocking at the time. I mean, very shocking. And at the time, it was shocking because it was like nobody ever thought of doing that. And it was also kind of concerning because now we're looking at it as like you can't use wild yeast to make clean beer. It's not going to happen. So now we have to go and buy yeast. Yeah. So that's a fundamental thing that we've always been proud of, that we now have to kind of turn back the tide and say, well, now we have to kind of buy yeast. Like, are we any longer really a traditional farmhouse brewery at that point? Probably not. Probably not.
Yeah.
So it's like you're going against your integrity at that point, and that's not something we're about. So knowing that, we kind of put it in a way where we're going to continue to make some of the beers that we make. We're going to continue to make at least 80 to 90% sour and wild beer, because that's what we do. Mm-hmm. But then this other little portion over here, we're going to make some general beers that we want to get weird with, that we want to get strange with, and kind of experiment over this side as well. And that was also a pretty big driving force behind it as well. Like, we really can't continue with that if we stay true to ourselves.
Bert, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you kind of hit it right on the head with that. It's, we as a collective group have all just kind of sat down and said, hey, we still want to get crazy. We still have all these really, really great ideas. And then if you're, perceived as a wild-based brewery and you're making clean beer, the perception is with Draai Laag, the name association just says wild beer. So you can't just put out a clean-based product. So, yeah, I think that overall it was a great way for us to kind of branch into this new avenue. It's definitely been an interesting transition. And overall, I mean, we've had great support from our distribution team. They've been nothing but supportive. So that's been super cool. Locally, like our local market has been really good. I think that there was that concern from our customer basis that, hey, brands, or beer that you guys put out, staples here, are no longer going to be available. And that's not the case. We're just simply building on those core lineup beers, and then we're adding some other really cool things too. So, yeah, just a nice way for us to branch out and still get weird.
So I'd like to also add, it was also the people that knew this brand, or the people that understood what we did, the people that appreciated what we did, if you would see that beer on a shelf, no matter where you were, your first assumption right off the bat is it's wild or it's sour. So a lot of customers said, well, why can't you just keep the Draai Laag name and make these beers? Well, it's because it's all market perception. And when you see that bottle, if you know the brand and you identify with the bottle and you identify with what we do, your first assumption is I don't feel like a wild and sour beer today. Whether or not you actually read that bottle, that's your first assumption off the top. So now, it's more inviting to have the name change. I mean, not necessarily inviting, but it's more or less like, I wonder what those guys are up to. I'm going to take the time to actually read this to see what they're doing now. And granted, it's a lot less clean beer than most other breweries would produce. But if it is a clean beer of ours, or if it is a little funky, or if it is a little wild, that it was a mix of something, or, your identification with the brand is going to be different than it was if it was Draai Laag. That's all.
Calling all Pittsburgh barley wine fans. One of the most badass events of the year is just around the corner. Hell with the Lid Off 15 is going down Saturday, March 23rd at Kelly's Bar and Lounge in East Liberty. This one-of-a-kind celebration of all things barley wine is the only event of its kind in the United States. We're talking aged barley wines dating back to the early 2000s and new barley wines from breweries all over the country pouring side by side. If barley wine is your jam, you cannot miss Hell with the Lid Off 15 on Saturday, March 23rd. A limited amount of tickets are still available. Visit Kelly's Bar and Lounge's Facebook page to find the show clicks link and grab your seat before it's too late.
This could be more just my obsession with words, but you guys had to have some pronunciation problems with Draai Laag.
Well, that's actually an added benefit. You're absolutely correct. So that was at the end of the line of all the reasons why, but you're absolutely correct. It's very difficult to be a brewery that started when, there were very little breweries and people still don't know how to pronounce your name 7 years later. Yeah. And to see, and, I'm not a marketing person. I should never, ever be in marketing whatsoever or anything involved with that. But it was definitely not the name that you would choose if you were opening up a new brewery. Just makes no sense.
It's funny that you say that you shouldn't be in marketing because I'm going to make you put your business cap on for a second.
Oh boy.
And again, what I wanted to focus on here is the whole rebranding process. So if you can, as much as possible, walk us through the timeline and some of the steps and the processes that you had to do in order to go from, okay, we're rebranding, we're going to go from Draai Laag to Strange Roots. How do we get from A to B?
Okay. The most difficult thing I would say is getting everybody on board to say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it. And quite frankly, it happened very quickly for us. And it was, I'd say the hardest part was going through all the regulatory side of things because you have to refile literally everything. Everything has to get transitioned into said new name, okay? On top of that, you have to also approach your customer base. That was the most difficult part, I would say. So preliminarily, we set it up and we said, okay, if we're going to do this, this is the timeline we would need to do everything. So the first thing that you would need to do is first, obviously, decide on a new name and decide, okay, how are we going to tell everybody that supported us for X amount of time that we're changing this name? And some of them really took it to heart. But that's not your first step. You just figure out, okay, how are we going to project this? Second step would be then contact your distribution outlets and talk to them.
And you have, not to interrupt, but how many
No.
states are you distributed in?
At the time with Draai Laag, roughly, I believe, 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a big undertaking as well.
It is, but it's not as aggressive as you may think because it's Shelton Brothers, right? Shelton Brothers deals with all of our distribution outside of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So we aren't a heavily distributed beer as in volume. We're heavily distributed, I guess, in just the pockets of areas where we're located. And
Okay.
they did a great job of doing that and putting it into the areas in which people would appreciate what we do and how we do it. But it sounds like a lot more than it actually is. So that's kind of number one. And there's still probably retailers today that don't even know we've even changed names. I would almost assume that there's distributors that don't know that we've changed names at this point.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's you'd be surprised how difficult it is to get that across to some people because not all those people see it on social media. Some people aren't social media people like myself, and it might take some time to actually physically get there. So that's kind of number one is we checked with all of our distribution outlets and we said, look, well, you figure we have Shelton Brothers and then we have Shangy's out in Philadelphia, and then outside of that we did select some customers that we have around here in the Pittsburgh area and asked them what they thought. We did contact some of our actual customers, physical customers that come in here, trusted customers, and said, what do you think about this? Like, this is what we're thinking about doing. How do you think it's going to be perceived? What are your thoughts? And we collected everybody's thoughts. And I would say overall, the number one thing is that as long as you don't change what you do, I don't care what you call it. And that was very uplifting and supportive. And I was just amazed that people saw it that way. I mean, some of the hardcore Draai Laag folks, which I still appreciate all of them, and they still come in here. Some of them were like, don't change the name, don't change the name. It's such a unique name. But they don't see outside of here how difficult it is from a pronunciation standpoint or remembering that name of that beer that you had at that bar that you might have had too many, but you really like that one, but you can't remember. All you remember, it's a funny name, but you can't find it. And, that wasn't necessarily like the rule of changing it, but ultimately that was a matter involved or a variable involved. So once all that's done and you're ready to make your changes, you have to keep in mind all your labeling needs to change. All of your products that you filed with the TTB needs to be changed. So all of those things need to come into understanding that it's not going to be cheap to do it. And at the same time, it's going to be extremely labor intensive from a paperwork side. So you better be prepared to do it, and you better be all in.
You also have all of your merchandising as well.
That's
Glassware,
right.
Yeah,
shirts,
right.
everything,
Yep.
Yeah.
Down
All
to
that
tap
stuff.
handles, name
Everything.
it.
Everything. So it's not an easy undertaking unless you're smaller. or unless you can afford to do it. So my suggestion is if you're going to do it, make sure you weigh your options heavily. And then once you're prepared, you need to make sure that you have set aside either extra capital or you're in the way of you can do this change without affecting your business negatively.
It's almost like you're starting a new brewery.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. And in fact, there's many customers from Philadelphia that, the Strange Roots name to them, we didn't distribute a lot when we first did the name change. We stayed more hyper local, and that was the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And there was people in Philadelphia that contacted me and said, this name change thing, and some of them didn't know about it, some of them did know about it. That was the most difficult part. And even now, they even said to me, many of people told me this, it's going to be just like you're starting all over again. Just like you're starting all over again,
How's everybody liking the background noise?
Yeah.
Life at a brewery, right? Timeline-wise, I mean, I think you've done a great job of painting the broad strokes of, like, this is what to expect. Yeah. How long did it take from point A to get, like, we're done. This is over. We are now Strange Roots. Let's roll.
I would say, well, we made the announcement, I believe it was in March. The idea was initiated at a realistic idea, I'd say, probably in December of 2017. Mm-hmm. And by March of 2018, we made the announcement, if it was in fact in March, but I'm not sure, but I think that was accurate. So even then, once it was made, the announcement's made, you're ready to make all the changes, it took yet again another 5 months to actually fulfill that by changing out all of your labeling and changing everything as you go. And it might be different for a smaller size brewery or a bigger brewery or whatever, but for our size, for what we produced at the time, it was about another 5 months after that until everything came down and everything was changed, and we are who we are now.
And you've got bottles out there that had to cycle through.
That's exactly
sales
right.
And,
Yep, that was the even toughest part because there's still even Draai Laag bottles out there now. Most of these people, you got to think, like most of these people are going to lay down those beers for maybe a year or two.
Right.
So I still see check-ins for Draai Laag beers. And it might be another year before we actually get rid of the majority of that stock. That's, well, not us personally, but that's out there.
So have you seen, is there still some brand confusion? Do people still not associate you guys with Strange Roots completely yet? Or is it more
I would agree with that. I would say that in some of the states where we're not heavily distributed or in some of the areas where we're kind of pocketed, I would say yes. I'd say that people don't even know yet, or people found out, quite frankly, from checking in on Untappd, and all of a sudden our Untappd accounts are Strange Roots Experimental Ales. And in their mind, they're going, well, what happened to Draai Laag? And then that leads them back to our Facebook post, and they're like, oh, they rebranded. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. And a lot of people attribute that to issues within the business. It wasn't an issue within the business. I mean, Draai Laag built all of this. So that wasn't the concern. It was more the concern of just being able to identify that one is now the other. Mm-hmm. They are still necessarily the same, and we haven't changed much of what we're doing other than that little bit. But for the most part, yeah, I would say that there is still probably a little confusion.
From your guys' standpoint, was there, once the rebrand was complete, was there any trouble embracing the new name or breaking those emotional ties that you had to the original name?
Personally, for me, yeah. I miss the Draai Laag name. I miss it because it was what there was a lot of that.
I'd have to think you created it. It's like almost like renaming your kid.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without a doubt. It was tough. It was definitely tough. And there's even times now where I say, man, maybe we should just bring back Draai Laag. But then at the same time, I say to myself, no, this was a conscious effort. We all bought into it. We all agreed that it needed to be done. And, even nowadays, it's just like as long as you're still putting in the bottle what you're happy with, I think that's the most important thing, regardless of the name of the brewery. It's just brand identification on the outside,
Just kind of like a nice way for us to completely start fresh, essentially. You have a whole new brand. You have a whole brand of new ideas, essentially. So just a nice way for us to kind of implement something different.
So now that the rebrand is complete, what's been the response? Negative, positive, combination of both?
I think for the most part, people have gotten used to it. So I don't know if that's the right way to present it. but I would say that they're accustomed to the change now. They realize, for the most of our customer base, that nothing has really changed with our beer to the point where it's a completely new brewery. I think for the most part, people have embraced it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there was that initial like fear of the unknown of what was going to come out or what we were going to be doing initially. I think after the first couple months, they could see we were still putting out the same quality beer. We were playing around with some things, but yeah, I think that overall the response has been really good. And after that 6-month period of time, people were kind of there. So yeah.
If anybody out there right now is thinking about this, obviously, from what we've covered today, it's a big undertaking. Lots to consider, lots to think about. So, having lived through this rebranding process, Dennis, what is one piece of advice you could give to anybody that's considering this and to make sure that they do it appropriately and effectively?
I'd say the first thing to do is if you have my information, contact me. That's what I'd say. I reached out to a couple of different breweries that did the rebranding, and it was kind of mixed thoughts and whatnot. And I had to go back to a very trusted friend and who is in the industry to kind of talk me through it, or find somebody that has done it that's willing to share some information with you. The second thing that I'd say is that just be really sure that this is what you want to do and how you want to do it. If you're completely changing directions 100% without a doubt, I'd say then I think it's worth your time to actually experiment with it and think about it ahead of time before you make the move. But I would say that that's probably the most beneficial change is if you're completely changing directions. If you're not and you're kind of doing what we did, I would lay heavily on whether or not, like for instance, so Draai Laag was not a marketable name. If you have a wonderful marketable name that you want to change directions to, but the name is such a good name, don't lose the name, just change your direction if you're happy with that. If you're not happy with the name or you're not sure exactly where it can go and how it can kind of develop, and if you're not going to base it on, if you're not changing the integrity of what you do, such as, like I said, with Draai Laag and it being a traditional farmhouse brewery and us individually saying we don't feel right doing this, knowing that we're going to buy even a small portion of yeast for our products. If it's an integrity issue or it's an internal issue like that, change the name. If it's not, and it's more or less because you don't like the name or something to that nature, I would weigh heavily on, is this really going to be beneficial and how exactly are we going to execute this? And people are free to email me or get in touch with me in any way, and I'll help out any way I can, anybody in the brewing industry, in trying to figure out this if you need it. If not, I completely understand. So I would say it really kind of depends.
Is that Dennis at strangeroots.com?
That's correct.
I guessed and nailed it.
Strangerootsbeer.com.
I screwed up. Strangerootsbeer.com.
Even I forget it now.
Well, this will be a good way to end it. And I think before I do ask this last question, I think just to interject and to piggyback on what Dennis said, I think when you're first starting out, I think it's important to really land on something that you're going to be comfortable with and you're going to be happy to build and evolve over time. But sometimes when it comes to rebranding, it may not require that complete change. Maybe just freshen up the logo or some new T-shirts or something. And there's lots of artists that are out there that can help with giving you a different feel and a different vibe. Sometimes that can help rejuvenate a brand versus having to go through a complete name change and all of that stuff.
Honestly, Jason, you're absolutely correct. And we did a rebrand of our logo. We changed our logo during the Draai Laag time period. And again, it's not necessarily for like a rejuvenation or increasing market demand or anything like that. It comes down to, at the end of the day, are you happy with what you've done? And our old logo, our original logo, although I should say this, it was a bad idea, a real bad idea. And it was my idea, and that's why it was bad. But then from a marketing standpoint, it did get changed, and it was beneficial, and people could identify with it better. And that, honestly, you're absolutely right. That could completely change your I guess that connection you have with your customer base to identify your brand outside of all the other thousands of brands that are out there currently on the market. That one simple change of a logo might be all that you need. And that's insignificant ultimately. I mean, that can be done at any point in time. Right. But a complete rebrand, I would just say double check everything and make sure that you're happy with it and know your reasons for what you're doing it for. And above all else, a good friend of mine told me, thyself be true. And I agree with that 100%.
Was there anything that you referred to when you were going down this path, whether it be a podcast, video, articles, anything that you could point people towards? I know you mentioned reaching out to some fellow industry folks, and I think that's always the top resource.
Yeah.
Because anybody that's lived through it can easily share their story. But was there anything in addition that you guys found that was very helpful to the process?
The only thing that I would say is we did find a few breweries that rebranded, but they did it really early on. Really early on. I don't know of anybody that has really substantiated some sort of a brand and then completely changed it. I mean, I know of some, but there's very limited articles on it. I would say the number one thing is that just know your customer base and how you're going to tell them. And honestly, it's just that's the best I would say. We never used any type of references or articles or anything to that nature. We just kind of decided on it, and our number one concern was, how are we going to tell our customer base that we're doing this? That's the best I could say.
No, that's great. I think we've really covered a lot. And again, if you're listening to this episode and you're considering rebranding, you've got a lot to ponder and a lot to consider. And I'm sure if you've stumbled upon this episode, you're either a loyal follower of the Breaking Brews podcast, or you've been considering rebranding, and this podcast happened to pop up in your searches. So hopefully we've been able to cover some good ground today. Dennis and Bert, thank you very much for giving your guys a story.
No, thanks for coming out, Jason.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here having a couple beers with you guys. And I think, again, we learned a lot today, and there's a lot for you guys out there to think about. So we're going to sign off now. But again, Dennis and Bert, thank you very much for taking some time and sharing your story. And cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
And there you have it, boys and girls. That is session 6 of the Breaking Brews podcast. I'd like to once again thank Dennis Hock and Bert Mooney of Strange Roots Experimental Ales for joining me on the show to drop some knowledge about rebranding. Hopefully you picked up some tips and strategies and some ideas if you are considering rebranding for your brewery or bar or restaurant too. Lots to think about and lots to ponder. So again, hopefully there was some knowledge here that helps you realize from two guys that went through it everything that you need to know. And if you are venturing down that path, best of luck to you with your rebranding processes. Before we sign off on today's episode of the Breaking Brews podcast, I did once again want to point out the giveaway that is going on through the rest of this week. So in case you missed it on the first 5 sessions of the show, I mentioned that I'm doing a $100 Visa gift card giveaway for one lucky listener. All you need to do to be entered to win that prize is jump over to Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whichever you want to call it, and drop a rating and review for the show. I appreciate the feedback, and by doing that, you're helping the show move up the ranks and find the ears of more beer professionals and beer enthusiasts just like you. So please do that, and also share an episode of the show via Twitter, via Instagram. Use the hashtag BBPod, that's BBPOD, and you can tag Breaking Brews Co. as well. That's Breaking Brews CO. When you do those two things, you are entered to win the $100 Visa gift card giveaway. That card is designed for you to purchase some beer with, since we are all about beer here on the Breaking Brews podcast. Of course, I can't control what you do with that, but it would be cool if you purchase some beer, as I said. So this is your last chance to do that. So as you're hearing this episode, as it drops on Wednesday, March 13th, you're going to have until Tuesday, March 19th, when Session 7 goes live, and I will let you know now, Session 7, I will be joined by Mr. Nick Bogaz, the owner of Caliente Pizza and Draft House. They were our release week sponsor. They just returned from a trip to the International Pizza Expo in Las Vegas, Nevada. So we had some things to talk about. Nick and I sat down before he left, and before the show starts next week, I'll let you guys know how they did in all of the competitions that they entered out in Vegas. And on that show, I will announce the winner of the gift card. So you've still got some time. So you've got 6 sessions of the show now that you can listen back on, formulate your opinion, jump over and drop that review. I greatly appreciate it. Again, not just from the standpoint of having you enter the contest, but also getting that feedback helps me do this show better. So hopefully as these episodes continue to unfold, they're going to continue to improve, and we're going to keep bringing you great content each and every week. So new episodes of the Breaking Brews podcast will be dropping every Wednesday. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play Music, and also you can connect to everything about the podcast on breakingbrews.com/podcast. Until next week, I am Jason Cercone. Again, enter the contest by jumping over to iTunes and dropping a rating and review for the show. Also, share an episode on Instagram and or on Twitter. Use the hashtag BBPod. Tag at Breaking Brews Co., and you'll be entered to win $100 in beer money. On that note, it is time to sign off. I am Jason Cercone. This has been Session 6 of the Breaking Brews podcast. And, as always, this has been The Word of the Port.